July 7th, 1944. The island of Saipan, Mariana Islands. Captain John O'Brien crouched behind a disabled Sherman tank, listening to sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Screaming. Thousands of voices screaming in unison from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The sound rolled across the cane fields like a physical force, building in intensity until it drowned out everything else. His hands tightened on his rifle. Around him, Marines checked weapons with trembling fingers. They had been fighting for 25 days straight. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and down to half strength. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 7th, something was coming toward them through those cane fields. Something that would prove to be the largest Banzai charge in Pacific War history. Within 6 hours, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers would be dead. The mathematics of what was about to happen defied all military logic. A coordinated mass suicide attack by Dai, the remnants of an already defeated garrison against prepared defensive positions. It should never have been ordered. It could not possibly succeed. Yet it came anyway, driven by a combination of desperation, honor, and the recognition that death was inevitable regardless of choice. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the Saipan Banzai charge begins not on July 7th but 25 days earlier when American forces invaded the island. Saipan was different from previous Pacific operations. This was not some isolated atoll defended by a few thousand troops. This was Japanese home territory, part of the inner defensive ring, administered as Japanese territory since World War I. 43,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians lived on Saipan. The garrison numbered over 30,000 troops. They had been preparing defenses for months. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the Japanese forces on Saipan. He was 62 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and Manchuria. He understood modern warfare. He had studied American tactics. He knew what was coming when reconnaissance flights reported the American invasion fleet approaching on June 14th. More than 300 ships, 800 aircraft, 70,000 American troops in the assault waves. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions would hit the beaches on the western shore. The Army's 27th Infantry Division would follow as reserve. Saito's defensive plan was sound. He positioned his forces in depth across the island's rugged terrain. Saipan was 15 miles long and 6 miles wide, dominated by Mount Tapashau rising 1,473 feet in the center. The terrain was brutal. Limestone cliffs, dense vegetation, caves, and ravines. Perfect defensive ground. Saito's artillery was positioned to cover the invasion, beaches. His infantry occupied prepared positions throughout the interior. He had tanks, artillery, and supplies stockpiled. Everything a competent commander needed to make the Americans pay dearly for every yard of ground. The invasion began at dawn on June 15th. Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions hit 8 invasion beaches simultaneously. Japanese artillery opened fire immediately. Shells walked across the beaches, exploding among landing craft and Amtraks. Marines took casualties before they reached the shore. Those who made it to the beaches found themselves under intense fire from machine guns and mortars positioned in the cliffs above. But the Americans kept coming. Wave after wave of landing craft deposited Marines on those beaches. They pushed inland despite casualties. They overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer firepower and determination. By nightfall on June 15th, 20,000 Marines were ashore. The beachhead was secure. Japanese counterattacks that night failed to dislodge them. Saito's carefully prepared defenses had been penetrated in a single day. What followed was 25 days of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific War. The Marines pushed north and east, clearing the island sector by sector. Every hill was defended. Every cave had to be cleared. Japanese soldiers fought from positions that required direct assault to eliminate. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, tank fire, artillery, naval gunfire. Everything was employed to dig Japanese defenders from their positions. The terrain multiplied the difficulties. Marines advanced through dense vegetation, where visibility was measured in yards. They climbed cliffs under fire. They assaulted fortified positions on commanding heights. Mount Taposhao required a week of fighting to secure. The summit provided observation over the entire island, so Japanese defenders clung to it desperately. Marines from both divisions converged on the mountain from different directions, grinding forward against determined resistance. Casualties mounted on both sides. The 2nd Marine Division alone suffered over 6,000 casualties in the first 10 days. The 4th Marine Division lost comparable numbers. The Army's 27th Infantry Division, committed to the center of the line, took heavy losses pushing through difficult terrain. Japanese casualties were far worse. Entire battalions were destroyed. Regiment after regiment ceased to exist as fighting formations. By the end of June, Japanese defensive positions had been compressed into the northern third of the island. Saito recognized what was happening. His forces were being systematically destroyed. American firepower was overwhelming. Every defensive position eventually fell. Japanese casualties were unsustainable. Ammunition and supplies were dwindling. There would be no reinforcements, no resupply, no evacuation. Tokyo had written off Saipan. The garrison was expected to fight, to the death, delaying the American advance as long as possible. By July 6th, Japanese forces held only the northernmost tip of Saipan. They occupied a pocket perhaps 2 miles wide and 3 miles deep, backed against the cliffs at Marpi Point. 27 days of combat had reduced the garrison from over 30,000 troops to perhaps 5,000 effectives. These survivors were exhausted, hungry, and low on ammunition. Many were wounded. All knew they were defeated. That evening, Saito assembled his senior officers at his command post in a cave near the village of Makunsha. Lieutenant Colonel Hideki Goto, operations officer for the 31st Army, recorded what happened in a diary recovered after the battle. Saito spoke without emotion. His voice was calm, matter of fact. There was no melodrama, no patriotic speech, just cold assessment of reality. "Our situation is hopeless," Saito told his officers. "American forces control the island. We hold only this small pocket. We have perhaps 3 days of supplies remaining. Ammunition is critically low. We have no artillery support, no air support, no naval support. Tokyo cannot send reinforcements. We cannot evacuate. We face 2 choices. We can continue defending these positions until ammunition is exhausted and we are destroyed piecemeal, or we can attack." The officers listened in silence. They knew what attack meant. A final assault against American positions, a Banzai charge on a massive scale, every available soldier thrown at the enemy in one desperate gamble. It was suicide. Everyone in that cave understood this. But it was honorable suicide. Death in combat attacking the enemy rather than death defending a hopeless position or death from starvation when supplies ran out. Saito continued. "If we attack, we will die. This is certain. But we will die as soldiers. We will inflict casualties on the Americans. We will demonstrate Japanese spirit. We will buy time, perhaps a few hours, perhaps a day, for the civilians to reach safety at Marpi Point. And we will die with honor rather than surrendering or starving in these caves." The officers agreed. There was no debate. The decision was made. At dawn on July 7th, every Japanese soldier capable of walking would attack American positions. The objective was not victory. The objective was maximum casualties inflicted before death. This was the final act, the last service these men could perform for their emperor and their nation. Saito drafted the attack order personally that night. It was distributed to all units before midnight. The language was formal, almost ceremonial. It acknowledged reality while framing the attack as a glorious sacrifice rather than desperate suicide. The order read, "There is no hope for victory in places where we do not have control of the air, and we are still hoping for our reinforcements. We are dying without avail under the violent shelling and bombing. Whether we attack or whether we stay where we are, there is only death. However, in death there is life. We must utilize this opportunity to exalt true Japanese manhood. I will advance with those who remain to deliver still another blow to the American devils and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. This was the calculus of the Banzai charge. Death was inevitable. Surrender was unthinkable. Defense was futile. Therefore, attack, die fighting rather than waiting to be killed. Inflict what damage possible in the final moments. This was the logic that would send thousands of men charging into machine gun fire at dawn. The Japanese soldiers who received this order reacted in various ways. Some welcomed it. Combat veterans who had fought since China, who had survived campaigns across the Pacific, saw the Banzai charge as a fitting end. Better to die attacking than to be burned out of a cave by flamethrowers. Others were terrified but accepted their fate. Young soldiers recently arrived from Japan, barely trained, understood they would die but believed they had no choice. A few, very few, questioned the logic. But questioning meant nothing. The order was given. They would obey. Through the night of July 6th into July 7th, Japanese soldiers prepared for death. They cleaned weapons with whatever materials remained. They checked ammunition, finding most had only a few rounds left. Officers distributed sake when available. Men wrote final letters to families, knowing those letters would never be delivered but writing them anyway. Some buried personal effects, hoping Americans might find and return them. Others destroyed everything so the enemy would get nothing. In some units, officers gave brief speeches. The words varied, but the message was consistent. You have served honorably. You will die honorably. Your sacrifice matters. Your families will be proud. The Emperor will remember. These were the last words many of those soldiers heard before the attack. The Japanese assault force numbered approximately 4,000 men. This included remnants of the 43rd Division, survivors of the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, naval infantry from base forces, construction troops, walking wounded from field hospitals, and even civilians pressed into service. Anyone who could carry a weapon was included. Many had rifles. Some had only bayonets lashed to poles. Others carried grenades or demolition charges. A few had machine guns with limited ammunition. There were even soldiers armed only with swords, expecting to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The Americans they would attack were positioned along a defensive line running roughly east to west across the island about 2 miles south of Marpi Point. The line was held by elements of the 27th Infantry Division in the centre and portions of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions on the flanks. The Marines on the flanks were relatively fresh, having been rotated to what was considered a quiet sector after heavy fighting elsewhere. The Army Division in the centre had taken significant casualties and was badly worn down by continuous combat. The weakest point in the American line was near the village of Tanapag. Here, the 105th Infantry Regiment held positions with companies badly under strength. Some rifle companies numbered fewer than 100 men instead of the normal 190. They were exhausted from weeks of combat. Ammunition was adequate but not abundant. Artillery support was available but limited by the need to support operations elsewhere on the island. This was where the Japanese attack would focus. At 0300 hours on July 7th, Japanese artillery opened fire. The barrage was brief, perhaps 10 minutes, using the last remaining ammunition. Shells fell on American positions, causing casualties and confusion. When the artillery stopped, silence returned. American soldiers tensed, knowing what silence after artillery meant. Something was coming. Then, they heard it. Screaming. Thousands of voices screaming in unison from the darkness. The sound was inhuman, terrifying, a wall of noise rolling toward them through the pre-dawn darkness. Japanese soldiers emerged from the cane fields and brush, charging toward American positions. They came in waves, one behind another, packed so densely that men touched shoulders. They screamed battle cries. Banzai, Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the Emperor. They fired rifles wildly as they ran, some threw grenades. Others simply ran forward with bayonets or swords, determined to reach American lines before being killed. The American response was immediate and devastating. Machine guns opened fire, rifles cracked, mortars thumped, Artillery forward, observers called in fire missions. Within minutes, American firepower was tearing into the charging Japanese. Bodies fell. The attack staggered. But more Japanese soldiers kept coming. Wave after wave emerged from the darkness, climbing over the bodies of those who had fallen, pushing forward into the fire. Private First Class Robert Anderson, a machine gunner with the 105th Infantry, described the first moments of the attack in a letter written days later. They came out of nowhere. 1 second there was nothing. The next second there were hundreds of them screaming and running straight at us. I started firing and didn't stop. The barrel got so hot I could see it glowing red in the darkness. Men were loading belts as fast as I could fire them. We killed dozens, maybe hundreds, but they kept coming. It was like a nightmare. No matter how many we killed, more appeared. The Japanese hit the American line in multiple places simultaneously. The main assault struck the 105th Infantry near Tanapag Harbour. Here, the line buckled under the weight of thousands of attacking soldiers. Japanese forces overran forward positions, killing defenders or forcing them to withdraw. They penetrated 200 yards into American positions before being stopped by desperate counterattacks. Captain O'Brien's company was in the path of the main assault. His position was overrun in the first 10 minutes. Japanese soldiers swarmed through his defensive line, bayoneting wounded, searching for targets. O'Brien and perhaps 20 of his men fell back to a secondary position near the disabled Sherman tank. They formed a perimeter and fought hand to hand. Japanese soldiers pressed so close that rifles were useless. Men fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, fists. The fighting was savage, intimate, desperate. O'Brien later reported killing 4 Japanese soldiers in close combat, the first with his pistol at arm's length, the second with a bayonet, the third and fourth with an entrenching tool when he ran out of ammunition and his bayonet broke. Around him, his Marines fought with equal desperation. There was no time for fear, no time to think, only the enemy in front of you and the need to kill him before he killed you. But the American line did not break. Despite the initial penetration, despite losses, despite the shock of thousands of screaming soldiers charging out of darkness, the Americans held. Junior officers and sergeants organized desperate stands at key positions. They pulled together survivors from multiple units, formed ad hoc defensive lines, and fought back. Artillery support was critical. Forward observers called in fire missions directly on American positions being overrun. Shells exploded among mixed groups of American and Japanese soldiers. The casualties were terrible on both sides, but the artillery stopped the Japanese advance. By 04:30 hours, 90 minutes after the attack began, the Japanese momentum had stalled. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, lay dead in front of American positions. But the attack was not over. More Japanese soldiers kept coming. Saito had committed everything. There were no reserves, no second wave waiting to exploit success. Everyone capable of fighting was already in the cot. Assault. They would continue attacking until they were all dead or physically could not continue. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Banzai charge at Saipan was different from previous Japanese attacks. It was larger, more desperate, and more coordinated despite being essentially a suicide mission. The attack had multiple phases. The initial assault focused on breaking through American lines. When that failed, Japanese soldiers shifted to infiltration tactics, trying to find gaps and weak points. Small groups penetrated deep into American rear areas, attacking command posts, artillery positions, and aid stations. Hospital facilities became scenes of horror. Japanese soldiers overran aid stations near Tanapag, killing wounded Americans in their cots. Doctors and corpsmen fought back with whatever weapons they could find. Some aid stations were defended by walking wounded who grabbed rifles and formed defensive perimeters around the seriously wounded who could not move. The fighting around these hospitals was particularly brutal because Japanese soldiers believed they were attacking combat troops rather than medical facilities. The American defenders believed they were protecting helpless wounded. Neither side gave quarter. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, battalion commander of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, organized the defense of a critical position near the regimental command post. His battalion had been reduced to perhaps 300 effectives from continuous combat. When the Japanese attack hit his positions, O'Brien moved constantly along his line, directing fire, organizing counterattacks, plugging gaps. He was wounded twice in the first hour but refused evacuation. By 0500 hours, Japanese soldiers had penetrated to within 50 yards of his command post. O'Brien grabbed a rifle and personally led a counterattack. He and perhaps 30 soldiers charged directly into Japanese forces, firing as they advanced. The counterattack stopped the Japanese penetration but cost O'Brien his life. He was shot multiple times but continued fighting until he physically collapsed. His men carried him back to the command post where he died minutes later. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions that morning. The Japanese attack continued through dawn and into full daylight. As the sun rose over Saipan around 0530 hours, the extent of the carnage became visible. Bodies covered the ground in front of American positions. Hundreds, then thousands, lying in heaps where machine gun fire had caught them. The cane fields were trampled flat by thousands of running feet, blood soaked into the volcanic soil. The smell of death hung in the humid morning air. But still the attack continued. Japanese soldiers kept coming, though in smaller groups now as the initial waves had been destroyed. They attacked piecemeal, squads and platoons charging isolated American positions. Some Japanese soldiers appeared to be unarmed, simply running toward American lines to die. Others carried only grenades, hoping to reach close enough to throw them before being killed. A few pushed disabled vehicles or carried makeshift shields made from palm logs, trying to provide cover as they advanced. American artillery was devastating. Forward observers called in fire missions continuously throughout the morning. Shells from 105mm and 155mm howitzers screamed in, exploding among attacking Japanese. Entire groups disappeared in eruptions of dirt and shrapnel. But the Japanese kept advancing. Survivors climbed over the bodies of comrades and continued forward until they too were killed. By 0700 hours, 4 hours after the attack began, organized Japanese resistance had largely ceased. What remained were scattered groups of soldiers, some still attacking, others simply trying to reach American lines to die in combat rather than waiting to be hunted down. American forces began counterattacking, pushing forward to reclaim positions that had been overrun earlier. The counterattacks revealed the full horror of what had happened. American positions that had been overrun were scenes of massacre. Dead Americans lay among dead Japanese, sometimes piled 3 or 4 deep. Aid stations had been destroyed, wounded men killed in their cots. Command posts had been fought over hand to hand, the evidence visible in the types of wounds: bayonet wounds, sword cuts, skull fractures from rifle butts and entrenching tools. This had been combat at arm's length, personal and brutal. Captain O'Brien survived the attack. He emerged from behind the disabled Sherman tank at dawn to find himself surrounded by bodies. He counted 16 dead Japanese soldiers within 10 yards of his position. His own losses were severe. Of the 70 men in his company at the start of the attack, 41 were dead or wounded. But they had held their position. The Japanese had not broken through. The final toll of the Banzai charge was staggering. American burial details working through July 7th and 8th counted Japanese bodies. The initial counts exceeded 3,000. Final estimates reached 4,300 dead Japanese soldiers. This represented nearly the entire remaining Japanese garrison on Saipan. Saito had committed everything to the attack and lost everything. American casualties were also severe. The 105th Infantry Regiment alone suffered over 650 casualties in the attack, including more than 400 killed. Total American casualties on July 7th exceeded 900, but the Americans had held their line. The Japanese attack had failed completely. General Saito did not survive to see the result of his final order. He committed suicide in his cave command post sometime during the morning of July 7th. His body was found days later by American troops clearing caves. Lieutenant Colonel Goto, who had recorded Saito's final conference, was killed leading one of the early attack waves. Very few Japanese officers survived the Banzai charge. Those who did mostly killed themselves in the following days rather than surrender. The aftermath of the charge revealed details that made the attack even more tragic. Many of the dead were barely trained. Young soldiers recently arrived from Japan, thrown into combat with minimal preparation. Others were walking wounded from field hospitals, some barely able to walk, armed with whatever weapons were available. Construction troops with no combat training, naval personnel with no infantry experience. Even some civilians had been pressed into the attack, given weapons or demolition charges and told to charge with the soldiers. American troops clearing the battlefield found evidence of how desperate the Japanese situation had been. Dead soldiers with empty stomachs, their bodies showing signs of malnutrition, rifles with only a few rounds of ammunition, grenades that had failed to explode because they were defective or too old, swords made from poor quality steel that had broken on first impact. These men had attacked knowing they had no real chance of success, armed with inadequate weapons, against an enemy with overwhelming firepower. The psychological impact of the Banzai charge on American survivors was profound. These were men who had seen heavy combat for 4 weeks. They had witnessed brutality and death on a scale that would haunt them forever. But the Banzai charge was different. The sheer scale of the attack, the desperation of men running into certain death, the savagery of the close combat, all combined to create memories that would not fade. Private Anderson, the machine gunner, described his feelings days after the battle. "I killed so many men that morning I lost count. The barrel on my gun burned out and we had to change it twice. My hands were burned from touching hot metal. My shoulders ached from the recoil. But what I remember most is the faces. Japanese soldiers running straight at us, knowing they were going to die, screaming as they came. Some looked terrified. Others looked determined. A few looked resigned, like they had accepted death and were just going through the motions. I killed them all. I had no choice. But I see those faces when I close my eyes." The tactical analysis of the Banzai charge revealed why it failed so completely despite initial success. Japanese forces achieved surprise in terms of timing and scale. The Americans did not expect an attack of that magnitude from a defeated garrison with minimal supplies. The initial assault succeeded in breaking through American lines at several points. Had the Japanese been able to exploit those penetrations, they might have caused far more damage. But several factors doomed the attack. First, American firepower was overwhelming. Machine, guns, rifles, mortars, and especially artillery created killing zones that no amount of courage could overcome. Japanese soldiers were mowed down in waves. Second, American junior leadership was excellent. Sergeants and junior officers organized desperate defensive stands without waiting for orders from above. They identified crisis points and responded immediately. Third, American logistics meant that ammunition never ran out. Forward units could call for resupply and receive it within minutes. The Japanese had no comparable system. Most critically, the Banzai charge violated every principle of military tactics. Frontal assault against prepared defensive positions with inadequate firepower support was suicidal. The Japanese knew this, but ordered the attack anyway. The decision was not based on military logic, but on cultural concepts of honor and the belief that death in combat was preferable to other alternatives. From the Japanese perspective, the Banzai charge achieved its limited objectives. It inflicted significant American casualties. It demonstrated Japanese fighting spirit. It bought time for civilians to reach Marpi Point, though what happened there was its own tragedy. And it allowed thousands of soldiers to die in combat rather than surrendering or starving. Whether these objectives justified the cost is debatable, but within the framework of Japanese military culture in 1944, the logic made sense to those who ordered and executed the attack. The American perspective was simpler. The Banzai charge was tactically foolish, strategically meaningless, but operationally dangerous because of its scale and ferocity. It demonstrated that even defeated Japanese forces remained dangerous, It showed that Japanese soldiers would accept any casualties to inflict damage on Americans. And it proved that the war would not end until Japanese resistance was completely destroyed, because surrender remained unacceptable to Japanese military culture. The Battle for Saipan officially ended on July 9, 1944, though small groups of Japanese soldiers continued fighting from caves for weeks afterward. The island was declared secure. American forces had suffered 14,000 casualties, including 3,300 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 41,000, with only 900 prisoners taken. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. The strategic consequences of losing Saipan were catastrophic for Japan. The island provided the United States with air bases within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. B-29 super fortress bombers would soon be flying from Saipan to strike Tokyo and other cities. The loss exposed the vulnerability of Japan's inner defensive perimeter. If Saipan could fall, any island could fall. The political consequences in Japan were immediate and severe. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war, was forced to resign on July 18th. His government fell because Saipan fell. The loss shattered the illusion that Japan could defend its territory against American assault. It revealed that Japanese propaganda about American weakness was false. It demonstrated that Japanese soldiers, despite their courage and willingness to die, could not overcome American material superiority. The Banzai charge became infamous in American military circles as an example of Japanese fanaticism and tactical foolishness. But studying the attack reveals deeper truths about why it happened and what it meant. The charge was not simply mass suicide. It was a calculated decision by commanders who understood their situation completely and chose what they believed was the most honorable course of action available. General Saito's decision to order the Banzai charge must be understood within the context of Japanese military culture. Surrender was not considered an acceptable option. Japanese military regulations stated that soldiers captured alive had disgraced themselves and their families. Officers who surrendered could expect their families to be ostracized, their names stricken from records. This was not empty threat. Japanese society genuinely believed that death was preferable to the shame of surrender. This belief created impossible situations for Japanese commanders defending hopeless positions. If they could not win and would not surrender, death was the only option. The question became how to die. Wait in caves to be burned out by flamethrowers, starve when food ran out, or attack, inflicting casualties before death. For many Japanese officers, the third option was the only honorable choice. Private First Class Shigeru Kinjo, one of the few Japanese soldiers captured after the Banzai charge, explained the thinking during his interrogation. Kinjo had been knocked unconscious by artillery fire during the attack and captured by Americans before he regained consciousness. He was deeply ashamed of his survival and initially refused to cooperate with interrogators. When he finally spoke, Kinjo described what officers had told soldiers before the attack. Our lieutenant told us we would all die on July 7th. This was certain. He said we could die defending our positions and achieve nothing, or we could die attacking and perhaps kill many Americans. He asked which death would bring more honor to our families. Every man chose to attack. We were not forced. We chose. Kinjo's statement reveals the psychological framework that made the Banzai charge possible. Death was inevitable. The only variable was whether that death would be passive or active. Japanese military culture valued active death, death while attacking, death that served some purpose, however minimal. The Banzai charge fulfilled that cultural requirement, even though it was tactically suicidal. American intelligence officers studying captured documents from Saipan found Saito's personal diary. The entries from late June and early July revealed a commander who understood military realities but remained bound by cultural expectations. One entry from July 2nd read, "The Americans have won this battle. Our forces are destroyed. Ammunition is nearly exhausted. Food will last perhaps 1 week. I have requested permission to withdraw surviving forces to the northern caves and continue resistance." Tokyo has denied this request. We are ordered to attack and die gloriously rather than surrender or starve. I will obey. This entry shows Saito proposed an alternative to the Banzai charge. Withdraw to defensible caves, conserve ammunition, continue fighting from positions that maximized American casualties while minimizing Japanese losses. This would have been tactically sound. But Tokyo rejected this approach because it prioritized survival over immediate attack. Japanese military doctrine demanded aggressive action even in hopeless situations. The rejection of Saito's proposal demonstrated how Japanese strategic thinking had become divorced from tactical reality by mid-1944. Tokyo knew Saipan was lost. They knew the garrison would be destroyed. But they demanded an attack anyway because passive defense did not fit Japanese military ideology. Better to die attacking and fail than to survive longer through sound defensive tactics. This thinking appears irrational from a Western military perspective. Why order an attack certain to fail when alternative approaches might achieve better results? But Japanese military culture in 1944 was not operating on purely rational military calculation. It was operating on a mixture of military necessity, cultural expectations, and the belief that spirit could somehow overcome material disadvantage. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, was central to military thinking. This belief held that Japanese soldiers possessed a spiritual strength that made them superior to materialistic Western soldiers. Early victories against Western forces in 1941 and 42 seemed to confirm this belief. Japanese soldiers with inferior equipment had defeated British forces in Malaya, American forces in the Philippines, Dutch forces in the East Indies. But by mid-1944, Yamato Damashi had been tested against American industrial capacity and found wanting. Japanese soldiers were as brave as ever. Their willingness to die had not diminished. But courage could not stop naval gunfire. Spirit could not destroy tanks. Determination could not overcome the simple arithmetic that America could replace casualties and Japan could not. The Banzai charge at Saipan was Yamato Damashi in its purest and most tragic form. Thousands of soldiers attacking because their culture told them that fighting spirit mattered more than tactical reality. They died believing their sacrifice had meaning, that their deaths served the emperor and the nation. Whether that belief was true, or whether they were victims of a military culture that valued death over survival, remains debated by historians. What is not debated is the impact of the Banzai charge on American planning for future operations. The attack demonstrated that Japanese garrisons would fight to virtual annihilation rather than surrender. This knowledge influenced American strategy for the remainder of the war. It meant every island would have to be taken by force. Every position would have to be destroyed. Negotiated surrenders were unlikely. The war would continue until Japan was physically incapable of resistance. This realization shaped American planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Military planners expected Japanese forces to resist with the same suicidal determination shown on Saipan and other islands. They projected massive American casualties for the invasion. These projections influenced the decision to use atomic weapons in August 1945. The logic was brutal but simple. Better to destroy Japanese cities with atomic bombs than lose hundreds of thousands of American soldiers fighting through Japanese cities against defenders willing to die to the last man. The Japanese soldiers who participated in the Saipan Banzai charge could not have known their action would influence decisions about atomic weapons. They were focused on immediate tactical situation, on following orders, on dying with honor. But their attack became part of the accumulated evidence that convinced American leadership that Japan would never surrender voluntarily, that the war would end only through overwhelming force or total Japanese defeat. The civilians on Saipan suffered their own tragedy on July 7th and the days following. Approximately 8,000 Japanese civilians had retreated to Marpi Point, the northernmost tip of the island, during the American advance. They were trapped there with nowhere to go. American forces approaching from the south, cliffs dropping to the ocean on three sides. Japanese military, personnel and civilian administrators told these civilians that Americans would torture and kill them if captured. This was propaganda, false information designed to prevent surrender. but many civilians believed it. They had been indoctrinated with years of propaganda describing Americans as barbaric demons who would commit atrocities against Japanese people. When American forces reached Marpi Point on July 9th, they witnessed horrifying scenes. Japanese civilians threw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender. Families jumped together, parents holding children. Some climbed to high cliffs and threw themselves onto rocks hundreds of feet below. Others waded into the ocean and drowned themselves. American soldiers watching from below tried to stop them, shouting in Japanese through interpreters that they would not be harmed. Some civilians believed and surrendered. Many did not. The exact number of civilian deaths at Marpi Point will never be known precisely. Estimates range from 800 to over 1,000 men, women, and children who killed themselves rather than face what they believed would be torture and murder by Americans. American soldiers who witnessed these mass suicides were traumatized. They had not expected to see families killing themselves. They tried to intervene but mostly failed. The Japanese military's propaganda had been too effective. These civilian deaths were directly connected to the Banzai charge. Saito's stated objective for the attack included buying time for civilians to reach what he believed would be safety at Marpi Point. He thought the remote location would allow civilians to avoid American forces longer, perhaps even survive until Japan somehow won the war. He did not anticipate that civilians would kill themselves en masse rather than surrender. The tragedy at Marpi Point revealed another consequence of Japanese military culture's refusal to accept surrender. Not only did soldiers die unnecessarily, but civilians died, believing propaganda that portrayed surrender as worse than death. The combination of military fanaticism and effective propaganda created conditions where thousands of people chose suicide over the possibility of survival. After Saipan was secured, American forces began the massive task of clearing caves and searching for Japanese holdouts. This work continued for weeks. Small groups of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the island's cave systems, emerging at night to search for food or attack isolated American positions. They had to be hunted down individually or in small groups. Some Japanese soldiers on Saipan did not surrender until months or even years after the battle ended. The most famous holdout, Captain Sakeo Oba, led a group of approximately 50 soldiers and civilians in the island's interior until December 1945, 4 months after Japan's surrender. Oba finally surrendered only after being shown proof that the war had ended and ordered by a senior Japanese officer to lay down his arms. Oba's group survived by raiding American supply dumps at night, growing vegetables in hidden gardens, and avoiding contact with American patrols. They were armed and dangerous, but avoided unnecessary combat. Oba's motivation was not to continue fighting, but to survive until rescue or until circumstances changed. His surrender after the war's end demonstrated that some Japanese soldiers could accept surrender when the cultural and military framework that demanded death in combat no longer applied. The contrast between Oba's calculated survival and the mass suicide of the Banzai charge reveals the range of responses available to Japanese soldiers in hopeless situations. Saito chose mass attack and certain death. Oba chose concealment and survival. Both were Japanese officers with similar training and cultural backgrounds. Their different choices show that Japanese military culture, while strongly emphasizing death over surrender, did not completely eliminate individual decision-making. The question of why Saito chose the Banzai charge when alternatives existed has been debated by historians. Some argue he had no choice, that Tokyo's orders were explicit and required an attack. Others suggest Saito believed the attack offered the only possibility, however remote, of achieving something meaningful before death. A few argue that Saito's age and traditional mindset made him incapable of considering unconventional options like Oba's guerrilla survival strategy. The most likely explanation combines all these factors. Saito was following orders from Tokyo that demanded aggressive action. He was shaped by a military culture that valued attack over defense. He was 62 years old, from a generation that had been taught that death in combat was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. And he commanded thousands of soldiers who expected their commander to lead them in battle, not hide in caves waiting for starvation. Within this, Framework. The Banzai charge made sense. It was culturally appropriate, followed orders, demonstrated proper military spirit, and offered soldiers an honorable death. That it was tactically foolish and strategically meaningless did not matter within the value system Saito and his officers operated under. They had chosen death. The only question was how to die with honor. American veterans of the Saipan Banzai charge struggled to understand this mindset. Captain O'Brien, who survived the attack, wrote in his personal journal weeks later, "Why did they attack? They had to know they would die. They had to see our positions, our weapons, our strength. Yet they came anyway, thousands of them, running into our fire, dying by the hundreds. For what? They gained nothing. They achieved nothing except their own deaths. I killed so many men that morning, and I still don't understand why they died." O'Brien's inability to comprehend the attack was shared by many American veterans. From their perspective, the Japanese action was irrational. If you cannot win, you surrender. If you must fight, you fight intelligently, using tactics that maximize your chances. You don't throw thousands of men at prepared positions in a frontal assault with no fire support and no chance of success. That's not courage. That's waste. But Japanese military culture defined courage differently. True courage meant accepting death without fear. True loyalty meant obeying orders without question. True honor meant fighting regardless of circumstances. Within this framework, the Banzai charge represented the highest expression of military virtue. Every soldier who participated demonstrated courage, loyalty, and honor by attacking despite knowing he would die. This fundamental difference in military philosophy helps explain why the Pacific War was so brutal and why it could not end through negotiation. American and Japanese forces operated under incompatible value systems. Americans valued survival and victory. Japanese valued honor and sacrifice. These values could not be reconciled. The war would continue until one side was physically incapable of fighting. The legacy of the Saipan Banzai charge influenced American military planning for the rest of the war and beyond. It became a case study in what not to do tactically, while simultaneously serving as evidence of how dangerous a defeated enemy could be if culturally opposed to surrender. Military planners studying future operations against Japan incorporated lessons from Saipan into their calculations. The most immediate impact was on planning for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the next major operations in the Pacific. American commanders expected determined resistance, extensive use of fortified positions, and final Banzai charges when positions became untenable. They positioned forces accordingly, ensuring reserves were available to contain breakthrough attempts. They coordinated artillery support to respond quickly to mass attacks. They prepared medical facilities for heavy casualties. These preparations proved necessary. Both Iwo Jima and Okinawa featured determined Japanese resistance and final Banzai charges, though none matched the scale of Saipan. The patterns established on Saipan repeated themselves. Japanese forces fought from prepared positions until those positions became untenable, then launched final attacks that inflicted casualties, but achieved no tactical objectives. The consistency of these patterns reinforced American belief that invading the Japanese home islands would require defeating an enemy willing to accept unlimited casualties. Projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, estimated hundreds of thousands of American casualties based partly on experiences like Saipan. These projections were controversial then and remain debated now, but they reflected genuine concerns based on observed Japanese behavior throughout the Pacific War. When Japan surrendered, in August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American forces occupying Japan discovered that preparations for defending the home islands had been extensive. Millions of civilians had been organized into militia units. Beach defenses had been constructed. Plans existed for mass attacks similar to the Saipan Banzai charge, but on vastly larger scale. Whether these plans would have been executed is unknowable, but their existence suggests Japanese military leadership was prepared to sacrifice enormous numbers of lives defending the home islands. The soldiers who died in the Saipan Banzai charge could not have anticipated that their sacrifice would influence decisions about atomic weapons and the end of the war. They were focused on immediate duty, on following orders, on dying with honor, but their action became part of a larger pattern that convinced American leadership that Japan would resist to the point of national suicide unless forced to surrender through overwhelming demonstration of power. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.